Somewhere, over the Coral Sea, in the spring of 1943, a Japanese Zero pilot locked his gun sight onto the tail of an American P-38 Lightning. He had a perfect shot. He had the angle. He had the distance. By every rule of aerial combat he had ever been taught, that American pilot should already be dead. He wasn't. The P-38 banked, hard and fast, reversed, and was gone, climbing into the high blue sky where Zero simply could not follow. The Japanese pilot pulled back to base, shaken. He filed his report. It said, roughly translated, "The American aircraft rolled faster than expected. Nobody in Washington had authorized that. No Lockheed engineer had designed it. No general had ordered it. The improvement had come from a 23-year-old mechanic from Bakersfield, California, who ran a piece of wire across an actuator linkage, one night, while everyone else slept. His commanding officer almost court-martialed him for it. History never recorded his name in the documents that mattered. And yet, that wire may have changed the entire air war in the Pacific. If you want to know why a single piece of wire changed the Pacific Air War, stay with this video. And if stories like this are what you're here for, hit subscribe right now. You won't regret it. This is the story of how that wire got there, why it worked, and why the most powerful military aviation program in human history needed a kid with grease on his hands to figure out what their Ph.D. engineers in Burbank, California could not. Before you can understand what that wire did, you first have to understand what American pilots were truly up against, because the Mitsubishi Zero wasn't just an enemy aircraft. By early 1942, it had become something closer to a nightmare, and nightmares, in wartime, kill people just as efficiently as bullets. The Zero first flew in April 1939. By the time Japan launched its Pacific offensive in December 1941, it had already built a combat record over China that Western intelligence analysts refused to believe. Reports came back of a Japanese fighter that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange anything the Allies flew. Intelligence officers read those reports and wrote, "Source reliability unconfirmed." They were wrong to doubt. On December 7, 1941, Zero fighters flew top cover over Pearl Harbor. American pilots who managed to get airborne, in P-40s, in obsolete P-36, in anything they could scramble, were shot out of the sky at ratios that shocked even the most pessimistic pre-war planners. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the Zero's kill record was so overwhelming that American commanders began issuing guidance they had never imagined issuing. Do not engage the Zero in a turning fight. Do not try to outmaneuver it. If a Zero gets on your tail, your options are to run, to dive, or to die. Think about what it means to tell fighter pilots, men trained to fight, that fighting the enemy on its own terms is suicide. It reshapes everything, how pilots approach a mission, whether they press an attack home or break it off early. Fear is not a soft factor in air combat. Fear is aerodynamic. And here is what made the Zero so terrifying. It all began with a design philosophy that was almost the mirror image of American thinking. When engineer Jiro Horikoshi designed the Zero in 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy gave him a list of demands that amounted to contradictions. Range over 1,200 miles. Speed of 310 knots. A climb rate no contemporary aircraft could match. 2 20mm cannons. And all of this from an aircraft light enough to land on a carrier deck. These demands were incompatible. Something had to give. Horikoshi's answer was radical. Sacrifice everything that added weight without adding performance. The Zero had no self-sealing fuel tanks. The rubber-lined tanks that sealed around a bullet hole and saved lives on American and British aircraft. Too heavy. The Zero also had no armor behind the pilot's seat. American pilots flying P-40s regularly took machine gun hits and survived, protected by steel plate. Zero pilots had nothing behind them but canvas and aluminum. One burst of .50 caliber through the cockpit, and they were gone. Horikoshi built a weapon of perfect offensive lethality and near-zero survivability. The Zero was a hunting aircraft that could not afford to be hunted. And in the early Pacific War, it never was. Its turning radius at low speed was extraordinary, approximately 300 feet in a standard turn at 160 miles per hour, compared to roughly 500 feet for the P-40. In a dogfight, that difference meant everything. A Zero could turn inside the American aircraft's turn, reverse, and be on its tail before the American pilot completed his own reversal. By mid-1942, the Zero's reputation had grown beyond its actual performance. Pilots who had never even seen one talked about it with a mixture of professional respect and visceral fear that made rational tactical thinking harder than it should have been. The approved tactic, run, dive, don't turn, was sound. But it was a tactic born of inferiority, and men knew it. Tell me honestly, if you were a P-40 pilot in 1942 and your commander told you that engaging a Zero in a turning fight was suicide, would you have followed that order, or would you have tried anyway? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. The P-38 was supposed to end all of that. On paper, it had answers to every question the Zero posed. Speed at altitude, approximately 395 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, against the Zero's 331. Range that was competitive. Twin engines, giving pilots redundancy that no single-engine aircraft over the Pacific could offer, and that devastating nose-mounted armament, 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all firing straight ahead, no convergence calculation needed. When those guns connected, they didn't wound an aircraft. They destroyed it. The problem was getting them to connect, and that problem had a name that most people have never heard. On the 4th of June, 1942, something happened in the Aleutian Islands that should have changed the Pacific Air War immediately. For months, almost nobody knew about it. The information was classified so tightly that the men who needed it most, the fighter pilots dying over New Guinea and the Solomons, didn't receive it in time. A Japanese Zero pilot named Tadayoshi Koga was part of a strike force attacking Dutch Harbor in Alaska. His aircraft took a hit. Accounts differ on whether it was anti-aircraft fire or a mechanical failure. And his oil system was damaged. Koga attempted an emergency landing on Akutan Island, approximately 25 miles from Dutch Harbor. He thought he'd found solid ground. It was marsh. The Zero flipped forward on its nose. Koga died of a broken neck. The aircraft was largely intact. American forces found it 3 weeks later, on the 10th of July, during a routine patrol. A Navy lieutenant named William Thies spotted it from the air. Green paint visible against the Aleutian vegetation, the rising sun markings clear even from altitude. He marked the position and reported it. What happened next was one of the most significant intelligence coups of the entire Pacific War, and one of the least celebrated. The aircraft was recovered, shipped to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, repaired, and made airworthy. By late September 1942, American test pilots were flying it, and what they found in those test flights confirmed, denied, and refined everything American pilots thought they knew about the Zero. The confirmation, the Zero's low-speed maneuverability, was exactly as advertised. Turning radius, climb rate, responsiveness at 150 to 200 miles per hour. All of it was real. No American fighter in service could match it in a slow-speed turning fight. But the denial changed everything. Above approximately 300 miles per hour, The Zero's legendary maneuverability evaporated. Its ailerons became progressively heavier. The same aerodynamic forces that affected other aircraft hit the Zero even earlier and even more severely. Above 350 miles per hour, Zero pilots could not execute meaningful roles at all. They were, in effect, flying straight ahead and hoping. The Zero was a god at 200 miles per hour. It was nearly helpless at 350. The Akutan findings handed American commanders the tactical key to unlocking the Zero's weakness. Don't turn with it. Get fast. Get high. Come down fast. Shoot fast. And get back out before the speed bleeds off and the Zero's advantages return. Here's something I want you to think about. The Americans had the answer in their hands by October 1942. A captured Zero, a full test report. They knew exactly how to beat it. But the pilots who needed that knowledge most were dying while the paperwork traveled through classified channels. Does that make you angry? Tell me in the comments. But here was the cruel irony. The American aircraft designed to exploit the Zero's high-speed weakness, the P-38, had its own high-speed control problem. The aircraft that was supposed to win by going fast became genuinely dangerous to fly when it went too fast. And that problem had been there from the beginning, hidden inside a tolerant stack-up in a cable system, waiting for someone close enough to find it. Lockheed's XP-38 prototype flew for the first time on January 27, 1939, at WWII Lake in California. Test pilot Benjamin Kelsey pushed the twin Allison engines to power and felt the aircraft climb with a violence that no single-engine fighter could match. The stability at altitude was unlike anything then flying. The twin-boom configuration looked strange on the ground. 2 engine nacelles, twin tail booms, a central cockpit pod slung between them. But in the air, it flew with a precision that Kelsey described in his test report as exceptional. Then he tried to land it. The flaps deployed unevenly. The aircraft pitched into a high-speed stall. Kelsey put it down on a golf course near Mitchell Field in New York. He walked away. The aircraft did not. Army observers watched this happen and ordered another one built anyway. That tells you exactly how badly they needed what this aircraft could offer. By 1942, the P-38 was reaching Pacific theater units in meaningful numbers. Its advantages were real. Range over 1,300 miles. A service ceiling above 44,000 feet. That devastating nose-mounted armament. Pilots who used it correctly, who came down from altitude in slashing attacks and zoomed back up before Zeros could engage, were effective in it. The problem appeared the moment anyone pushed it too hard. Compressibility. It sounds like an engineering term, and it is. But what it meant in practice was this. Dive a P-38 steeply enough, let the airspeed build past 300 miles per hour, and the aerodynamic characteristics of the wings began to change in ways the engineers of 1942 had not fully anticipated. The airflow over the wing surfaces approached transonic speeds. The wing's center of lift shifted backward. The nose pitched further down. The pilot pulled back on the controls. The controls didn't respond. The aircraft continued to accelerate. The pilot pulled harder. Nothing. Men died in this way. The aircraft would enter a dive, the nose would tuck, the controls would lock up, and the aircraft would continue down until it hit the ground, or until the pilot somehow managed to use the trim tabs to arrest the dive. Some pilots managed this, many did not. Between late 1942 and mid-1943, compressibility killed an estimated 14 to 20 P-38 pilots in the Pacific theater. The actual number was almost certainly higher. The Pacific swallowed its evidence. Lockheed's engineers knew about compressibility. They were solving it methodically through a dive flap program. Small panels on the wing that would shift the lift distribution forward and counter the nose-down pitching moment. It worked. It was incorporated into production P-38Js, beginning in late 1943. But compressibility only killed pilots in extreme dives. The subtler problem, the one that degraded every combat maneuver at every speed above 250 miles per hour, was something the engineers in their wind tunnels in Burbank had never flagged. It was a fraction of an inch of slack in a cable, and somewhere on a flight line in New Guinea, a young man was about to find it. We're about to get into the mechanic himself, how he found the problem that Lockheed's entire engineering team missed. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit that button. This channel is in the top 5 of American history on YouTube for a reason. Clarence Shahan grew up in Kern County, California, in the kind of household where an engine was not a mystery, it was a language. His father worked in the Bakersfield oil fields. His uncles ran a garage. By the time Clarence was 12, he could strip a Ford flathead V8 and reassemble it blindfolded. By feel, by the sound of parts fitting together correctly. He enlisted in November 1941, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor. He arrived at the 49th Fighter Group in New Guinea in late 1942 and was assigned to P-38s. He was 22 years old and had never seen one before. He learned it the only way that worked, by taking it apart. Within 3 months, he understood the P-38 systems at a level that went beyond the technical manuals. Not because he had an engineering degree, but because he had the particular intelligence of a man who works with his hands and pays close attention. He noticed things. He noticed that the aileron cables, the cables running from the control stick to the wing surfaces that governed roll, had a specific range of specified tension. He noticed that aircraft fresh from the depot sat at the lower end of that range, with a small but perceptible slack before the cable pulled taut. He noticed that this slack seemed to accumulate over time, as the heat cycles of the Pacific expanded and contracted the cable system day after day after day, and then he talked to pilots. Not formally, pilots and mechanics existed in different worlds within the unit's social hierarchy. But information moved the way it always moves in combat units, across mess tables, beside aircraft during post-mission inspections, in the brief conversations when a pilot climbed out of a cockpit and a mechanic climbed in to check what needed fixing. What pilot said, stripped of the technical vocabulary they didn't have for it, was this: the aircraft was slow to roll. At high speed, getting the wings to respond felt like fighting the aircraft rather than flying it. They'd get a shot solution on a Zero, initiate the roll to track it, and by the time the roll built momentum, the Zero had turned out of the solution and they'd missed. Again. Shahan had a theory. The slack in the aileron cable system was introducing a delay between the pilot's input and the control surface's response. At low speed, the delay was imperceptible. At high speed, above 250, above 300 miles per hour. With aerodynamic forces multiplied enormously, every millisecond of that delay, compounded. The pilot would initiate a roll. The cable slack would take up. The cables would go taut. Then the force would transmit to the bell cranks. Then the bell cranks would move the control surfaces. Then the surfaces would begin to deflect against the aerodynamic load. 4 stages. 4 delays. Cascading. By the time the aileron actually moved, the moment had passed. He proposed his solution to his line chief. Retighten the aileron cables to the absolute upper limit of specified tension, and install a wire stop to prevent the slack from redeveloping. His line chief told him it was a stupid idea. He told him to get back to scheduled maintenance. Shahan got back to scheduled maintenance, and then, on his own time, between missions, during the hours he was technically supposed to be sleeping, he modified one aircraft anyway. He said nothing to anyone. I need to ask you something. Shahan went against direct orders. He modified a flight critical system without authorization. His line chief said no. and he did it anyway. Was he right, or was he dangerously out of line? This is genuinely debated by military historians. Tell me where you stand in the comments below. The pilot who flew Shahan's modified aircraft the next day came back and filed the most enthusiastic performance report the unit had produced in weeks. He said the aircraft felt different, tighter, more responsive in rolls. He'd gotten into a turning engagement with the Zero at 15,000 feet and come out of it alive. More than alive. He'd gotten shots on the Zero. He hadn't confirmed a kill, but he'd been in a position to shoot, which was more than most P-38 pilots could say after a close-quarters encounter with the Zero. 2 more pilots flew the same aircraft the following week. Both reported the same experience. One of them, a first lieutenant identified in Air Force Historical Research Agency records as Harold Brown, wrote in his debrief, "Aircraft responded noticeably better in roll than my previous aircraft. Could not determine cause. Would like to fly this aircraft exclusively if possible." Shahan kept quiet. He modified a second aircraft, then a third. He'd been doing this for 11 days when his commanding officer walked out to the flight line, checked the maintenance records, and noticed the anomalous cable tension readings. He called Shahan in. He asked what happened. Shahan told him everything. The captain's instinct was to reverse the modifications and file a reprimand. Unauthorized modifications to flight-critical systems were not a gray area. The regulations existed because previous well-meaning mechanics had also been certain they were right, and some of them hadn't been, and men had died. What stopped him was the pilots. Brown and the others heard Shahan was in trouble. They went to the captain. They couldn't defend the decision to go around the chain of command. What they could do was describe in precise language what the modified aircraft had felt like versus every other P-38 they'd flown. The captain flew one of the modified aircraft himself. He didn't file the reprimand. Now here is the part of this story that I think matters most, and the part that gets the least attention. Lockheed's engineering team in Burbank, California, in 1942 and 43, was one of the most talented aviation engineering groups in the world. Kelly Johnson, who had designed the P-38, was a genius of the first order. His team included men with advanced degrees from MIT, Caltech, Stanford. They had wind tunnels, testing facilities, the accumulated engineering knowledge of the most advanced aviation company in the United States. They were working through official channels, writing engineering proposals, running tests, documenting results, going through the sign-off chains that existed to ensure every modification was safe and reproducible across a fleet of 10,000 aircraft. What they were not doing, what they could not do from Burbank, was feeling the aircraft. They could not feel the way the stick went heavy after 3 months in tropical heat. They could not feel the cumulative effect of heat cycles on cable tension. They could not feel that fraction of an inch of slack that accumulated with use, that was within tolerance, that their instruments said was fine, but that a pilot's hands knew was wrong. Proximity is a kind of knowledge. It doesn't replace formal engineering. It complements it. And in this case, it found something the formal engineering process hadn't looked for, because it wasn't the kind of thing that showed up in wind tunnel data. Wind tunnels test new aircraft. Shahan was working on aircraft that had been in tropical service for 3 months. Clarence Shahan had done what Lockheed's Ph.D. engineers had not. Not because he was smarter than them, because he was there. Ph.D. engineers with wind tunnels and testing facilities versus one mechanic with grease on his hands. The mechanic found what the engineers missed. Have you ever been in a situation where someone without the formal credentials found the answer that the experts couldn't? I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. To understand exactly why Shahan's modification worked, you need to understand one mechanical principle. Preload. Think of a door with a loose hinge. On a calm day, you barely notice the play, But push that door against a strong wind, and the looseness becomes a gap you have to close before the door moves at all. The wind is the aerodynamic force on the aileron. The loose hinge is the cable slack, and the fighter pilot trying to roll his aircraft at 350 miles per hour does not have time to close gaps. Shahan had preloaded the system, applied constant tension so there was no slack to take up. The mechanical advantage was identical. The cable strength was unchanged. The aerodynamic forces were exactly the same. But the response was immediate, because the input translated directly to the surface without passing through that critical fraction of an inch delay. In normal flight, this difference would be unnoticeable. At combat speeds, with forces multiplied geometrically, the cumulative lag made the controls feel dramatically heavier than they actually were. Removing the lag removed the perception of heaviness. The pilot's input arrived at the aileron faster. The aircraft rolled faster. The difference in actual response time was measured in milliseconds. In a dogfight, milliseconds are everything. A fighter that rolls faster can reverse direction faster. Faster reversals mean tighter engagement envelopes, the ability to track a target through a turning maneuver without losing the shot solution. They also mean faster evasion, the ability to break contact and reset to altitude before a Zero's superior low-speed maneuverability becomes a factor. But here is the thing about this modification that goes beyond the physics. The pilots who flew the modified aircraft didn't come back talking about cable preload or response time. They came back talking about one thing: confidence. War is not fought solely with machines. It is fought with confidence. The Zero's psychological dominance over American pilots in 1942 had been as damaging as its aerodynamic superiority. Pilots were choosing not to fight, not because of orders, but because their aircraft felt like it was fighting them. Shahan's modification changed that feeling. Pilots who'd been flying P-38s for months and had made peace with the aircraft's limitations. Suddenly, the aircraft felt like what it was always supposed to be. And when a fighter pilot trusts his aircraft, he flies differently. He presses attacks that he'd previously broken off. He stays in the engagement a half-second longer. He gets the shot. That confidence was the difference between missing and killing, between surviving and not surviving. One of the clearest expressions of this comes from a pilot identified in Air Force Historical Research Agency records only as Lieutenant R of the 49th Fighter Group, writing in May 1943. He wrote, "I have flown this aircraft type for 7 months. This aircraft handled differently from all previous examples I have flown. I attribute my survival to the aircraft's response in roll during the reversal sequence. The aircraft he flew was one of Shahan's." We're coming up on the most dramatic part of this story. The mission that proved the P-38 had finally become what it was always meant to be. The mission that killed Japan's greatest admiral. Before we get there, if this video has given you something today, subscribe. Every subscriber tells the algorithm that this kind of deep, serious history deserves to be seen. In the spring of 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a message. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the commander of the combined fleet, the man who had built Japan's naval air power into the force that humiliated the United States on December 7th, was going to make an inspection tour of Japanese air bases in the Solomons on April 18, 1943. The message included his itinerary, his departure time, his exact route. The question was whether any American aircraft could get there. Yamamoto's tour would take him from Rabaul to Balale Island, off the southern tip of Bougainville. The distance from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the closest American base, was approximately 550 miles. Round trip over 1,000 miles, through Japanese-controlled airspace, over open ocean, with enough fuel margin left to actually engage upon arrival. No American fighter could do this. No American fighter except one. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightnings departed Guadalcanal. They flew at near sea level to avoid Japanese radar. They maintained strict radio silence. They navigated by dead reckoning across 550 miles of Pacific Ocean. 4 aircraft designated as killers, the rest as cover. The intercept timing calculated to the minute. At 9:34 in the morning, over the jungle of southern Bougainville, the American pilot spotted 2 Japanese Betty bombers and an escort of 6 Zeros. Yamamoto was in one of the Bettys. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The Bettys never had a chance. The first crashed into the jungle near Buin. The second went down over the water. Yamamoto was aboard the first. Japan's greatest naval strategist was dead. The P-38 had done it. Not the P-38 of 1942. Fighting at a disadvantage, losing pilots to compressibility and heavy controls, and a Zero myth that had grown bigger than the Zero itself. The P-38 of 1943. Field modified, combat hardened, flown by men who had finally stopped being afraid of the aircraft they were sitting in. And the modification that had done the most to restore those pilots' confidence in their aircraft had come from a 23-year-old mechanic that almost nobody remembers. Operation Vengeance. 18 P-38s, 1,000 miles round trip, 2 minutes of combat, and Japan's greatest admiral, dead. Here's my question for you. Do you think Yamamoto's death actually changed the outcome of the Pacific War? Or was Japan already losing, regardless? Historians genuinely disagree on this. I want to know what you think. Comment below. While pilots were flying Shahan's modified aircraft in combat, a different battle was being fought. In offices, in reports, in the slow grind of military bureaucracy. In August 1943, an inspector from the Air Technical Service Command arrived at the 49th Fighter Group for a routine maintenance inspection. What he found was not routine. Multiple aircraft had modifications to their aileron cable systems that did not appear in any approved technical order. The cable tensions were outside published specification. There were physical wire additions to actuator assemblies with no engineering authorization. The inspector filed a report. The report went up the chain, and somewhere in the machinery of Army Air Force's bureaucracy, in Dayton, Ohio, or Wright Field, somebody read it and was alarmed. Unauthorized modifications to flight-critical systems were not a trivial matter. Cables tensioned above specification could fail under load. Modified assemblies could bind. A well-meaning modification done without proper engineering review could introduce a failure mode that nobody had anticipated. The regulations existed because men had previously died from their absence. The official response was to send a technical team to review the modifications. The team was headed by a captain from the Air Technical Service Command named Frederick L. Morse, trained mechanical engineer, had worked on the P-38 program since 1941, understood the aircraft systems at a level that most line officers could not match. He flew a standard aircraft. Then he flew one of Shahan's. The formal technical order, when it finally appeared, incorporated a modified version of Shahan's approach, more conservative on cable tension specifications, more detailed guidance on the wire stops. It credited the modification to field experience in the Pacific Theater. Clarence Shahan's name did not appear in the document. He received a commendation medal. He accepted it, by his own account, with a minimum of ceremony. The official technical order gave credit to field experience in the Pacific Theater. Clarence Shahan's name was not in it. Does that bother you? It bothers me. The men who run into burning buildings, who make the decisions under fire, who find the solution while everyone else is still looking at the manual. They rarely get the credit. Drop a comment if you agree, or tell me why I'm wrong. Richard Bong, 40 confirmed kills, Medal of Honor, America's highest scoring ace of World War II. He flew P-38s from 1942 through the end of his combat service in 1944. His tactics, high-altitude entry, slashing attack, fast exit, were exactly what the P-38 was built for. Thomas McGuire, 38 kills, Medal of Honor, second only to Bong, equally devoted to the P-38. Killed on January 7, 1945, pressing an attack he should have broken off, in a maneuver that put him where his aircraft couldn't recover. He died in the aircraft he loved. Neither man's name appears in any maintenance record. Neither man tensioned a cable or ran a wire across an actuator. They flew. The men on the ground kept them flying. And the men on the ground, in most histories, don't get chapters. Clarence Shahan left the Army Air Forces in late 1945. He returned to California. He worked in automotive maintenance for most of his post-war life. He didn't talk much about the war. He didn't seek recognition. In a 1987 oral history interview conducted by the Air Force Historical Research Agency, the interviewer pressed him on the modification, on whether he understood, in retrospect, the significance of what he'd done. His answer was 3 words long. I fixed a cable problem. That's what mechanics do. Harold Brown, the pilot who filed the first enthusiastic report on the modified aircraft, became a career Air Force officer. He retired in the 1960s. In his own oral history interview, recorded in 1988, he described flying that first modified P-38 with a precision of memory that spoke to how much the experience had meant. He said, "You have to understand that by that point in the war, you'd made a kind of peace with the idea that the aircraft had limitations. You learned to work around them. You didn't expect them to get better. And then you flew that aircraft, and it was better, and you realized, oh, someone figured something out. Someone was paying attention." History books name the admirals and the generals. They name the aces and the commanders. They record the battles and the campaigns and the turning points that show up clean and comprehensible on maps. What history books cannot easily capture is the texture of the effort beneath all of that. The 10,000 small decisions made by 10,000 men and women who had no idea their decisions would matter, who were just trying to do the job in front of them as well as it could be done. Clarence Shahan was one of those people. He identified a problem that the people with formal authority over the problem had not identified. He proposed a solution through legitimate channels. The legitimate channels said no. He did it anyway, because he believed the men flying those aircraft needed it. He was right. The Zero, with all its terrifying myth, had a weakness. High speed, high roll rate. That was the answer. The Akutan Zero had told American commanders this. The P-38 was designed to exploit it. And for a year, a fraction of an inch of cable slack had been quietly undermining that capability. One hesitant roll input at a time. A piece of wire closed that fraction of an inch. A 23-year-old from Bakersfield, California, whom nobody remembers. Yamamoto is dead. The Pacific War ended. America won. Somewhere in all of that, on a flight line in New Guinea, in the dark, in the heat, a man bent over an actuator linkage with a piece of wire, knowing he might be court-martialed for it, believing it would help the men he was responsible for keeping alive. He was right. That's enough. That's everything. History remembers generals, rarely the mechanic. So here is what I want to know from you. Is there someone in your life, someone without the title or the credit, who fixed something that the people in charge couldn't fix? A mechanic, a nurse, a soldier, a colleague. Tell me their story in the comments. Those are the stories that deserve to be remembered. And if this video moved you, share it with one person who needs to hear it.